The void has always been more than silence. In Warhammer 40K, when chaos breaches the line, Loyalists don't just face an enemy, they witness reality itself bending against them. No soldier of the Astra Militarum, no warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, no zealot of the Cerritus escaped unchanged. Even the unblinking custodian guard has felt the atmosphere shift, as though the air itself has chosen a side. The breach is not merely tactical, it is personal. Flesh, faith, and fire all tremble when the impossible walks uninvited into the trench. And before we descend fully into that, darkness into the smoke, hymns and blood, remember, this channel survives because of your strength. Like, share, and subscribe, and carry the banner forward so more can endure these tales. Now, let us begin. The earth was not soil. It was layered flesh, bone, and ash crushed so finely that every step sank a boot into memory. The trenches were shallow, dug not with hope of holding, but with desperation to mark some boundary between the living and the inevitable. The Astra Militarum called them lines, but there were no lines, here only ditches filled with men who prayed their less fire might matter against what was coming. Their rifles spat red in the mist, sparks against a storm too wide to see, and each shot felt like an oath already broken. Ash drifted with the fog, carrying the taste of promethium and old blood into lungs that no longer remembered clean air. Voices carried across the mud, but not as shouts. The voxnet stuttered, breaking down into distortion that bled into the very air, until soldiers heard themselves speaking words they had not said. Hold fast, hold fast. The phrase repeated in voices too close to be real, sounding like echoes from the back of their own skulls. Men flinched when their comrades turned, because for a heartbeat the face beside them was their own. The breach did not begin with thunder or charge. It began with the subtle unraveling of certainty, when no soldier could trust whether the man next to him was answering orders or mocking them in the dusk. The trench filled with light, not from fire, but from the sheen of eyes. Every soldier's gaze caught reflections that did not belong. Helmets were fixed forward, rifles braced, yet each man felt watched, not from beyond the parapet, but from beneath the ground. The mud shifted, as if something below listened. To kneel in the trench and press a hand into the soil was to feel a pulse, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of a corpse too vast to unearth. Some spat and withdrew their hands, others prayed, whispering catechisms that clung to their lips like frost. The officers moved among them, their voices steadier than their steps. They told their men the line would hold. They said it as doctrine, not as belief. Their eyes betrayed them, darting toward the horizon where smoke veined upward without fire to birth it. Somewhere beyond sight, artillery pounded, but here, in this shallow grave called a defense, guns rarely answered. Shells had been rationed, promethium thinned with oil, last packs drained to half charge. The soldiers fought with sound more than with death, firing volleys that lit the air but struck nothing real. Each pull of the trigger was less about killing than about convincing the next man that he was not alone. Night deepened, but darkness did not fall. Instead, a pale hue washed the field, as though the moon itself had bled into the mist. Shapes moved beyond the wire. Some looked like men, some looked like beasts. None resolved clearly enough to target, and when less fire lanced out to strike them, nothing fell. The echoes of impact came late, sometimes from behind the trench, sometimes from the sky. No soldier could say where his shot had landed, and so they fired anyway, because not firing meant silence, and silence meant listening to the whispers return. A guardsman named Theron dropped his rifle after a volley. His hands would not open. The weapon clung to his palms as if welded. He screamed until another pried it loose, skin peeling in strips as though the lasgun had grown roots. Medicae kits ran dry fast, their salves reduced to rationed dabs that could not numb the sting. Men wrapped wounds with banners torn from their own packs, and soon the trench filled with scraps of cloth soaked red, green, and gold Imperial colors, reduced to makeshift bindings. Faith was not found in victory here. Faith was found in bleeding beside someone who still drew breath. Rats fled the earth, as if the ground beneath had soured. They poured through dugouts and supply holes in frantic streams, scattering across the men's boots, some climbing torsos, gnawing at straps and packs. None of the soldiers swatted them away. They only watched, too afraid to strike anything that might not bleed as it should. The vermin vanished into the distance, fleeing a battle that had not yet begun. Only men remained. When the wind rose, the banners nailed into the trench walls rustled backward, as if drawn toward the enemy's side. Men turned their eyes away, afraid to see the Aquila bow. Chaplains would have torn them down, burned them in promethium flames, declared loyalty stronger than air itself. But there were no chaplains here, only line soldiers, and the thin faith they carried like embers cupped against the cold. They held their breaths, not in reverence, but in dread of what they might inhale next. The first body fell without a wound. A soldier slumped mid-prayer, his rosary beads clicking against the mud. No blood marked him, no shot reached him. His eyes stared upward, reflecting not stars, but a smear of red haze no one else could see. His comrades pulled him into the trench, checked his pulse, found none. When they closed his eyes, they opened again, blank, glassy, and turned toward the horizon. Men whispered his name, then stopped, as though speaking it aloud had given it away to the breach. The corpse was left against the wall, propped like a sentry no one wanted to relieve. As the hours dragged, lasbecks dimmed, water tasted of iron, and the soldier's teeth ached as though grinding grit too fine to spit out. Each man felt the trench shift lower, as if sinking into something beneath. Shovels leaned unused against the walls. No one dared dig deeper. The mud was no longer earth. It was the boundary. Digging meant breaching it from their side, and none wanted to be the one who tore that veil by dawn or what passed for it under a sky smudged. Gray the line was less a defense than a waiting room. Men leaned on rifles, heads bowed not in prayer, but in exhaustion. Their eyes swam with sleeplessness. Their lips muttered words they swore they never thought. Some began speaking in cadence with the vox static, their mouths forming syllables to clean for fatigue. And when they realized the voices they mimicked were their own, they broke into silence again. Ash clung to their armor, their lashes, the cracks in their lips. It burned like salt, crusting until they tasted themselves dissolve with each breath. The trench had become a place not of battle, but of erosion, where men wore down before steel was tested. Still, they held rifles ready. Still they peered into the mist. Still they told themselves the line might matter. Yet, beneath the whispers, beneath the rising mist, every soldier knew the same truth. The breach had already begun. They stood shoulder to shoulder, but none trusted the shoulders they brushed. At first it was a trick of exhaustion. Men swore they saw their squad mates twice, once in the trench and once beyond it, both moving in perfect unison until one blinked and the other did not. The breach widened, not with thunder, but with recognition out of place. A voice would call down the line, a familiar tone that carried memories of rations shared, scars compared, prayers whispered. Then the soldier who answered would freeze, for the voice had come from a mouth he knew belonged to a corpse buried 2 campaigns ago. Names spread along the trench like infection. Maheki, Tovan Jiras. Each man called for someone he trusted, and each turned to see the face of that comrade smiling back. But the smiles were too long, the eyes too wide, the uniforms sewn with threads that shimmered like wet stone. They looked almost right, but not enough. Every soldier realized it realized only after they had let their guard fall for the space of a breath. Only after the illusion had leaned too close. Only after its gaze had not stopped at their face but seemed to crawl deeper. One man broke first. He drew his bayonet against the figure that wore his brother's face, and when steel pierced flesh, Blood spilled in ribbons that melted before it touched the ground. The figure did not scream. It only smiled wider, teeth multiplying in its mouth, as though the grin needed more rows to hold. Breck's real comrades pulled him back, but none dared look too long at the thing collapsing into ash. They turned on him instead, whispering that perhaps he had struck a loyal man. Perhaps he had murdered kin. The doubt spread faster than the breach itself. The trench no longer echoed with orders. It echoed with hesitations. Each man kept a fraction of his eye trained on the comrade beside him, as though waiting to see a slip, a twitch, a detail that did not belong. Fingers trembled on triggers. Lasguns spat light into nothing when a shadow shifted wrong. Officers tried to keep formation, but even their words failed, for when they barked commands, echoes answered in tones too precise. Men obeyed orders that had not been given, following voices that belonged to no one they could see. Sleep became an enemy more dangerous than fire. Soldiers closed their eyes for a heartbeat and woke to find comrades' faces changed. Helmets twisted, eyes sunken deeper, teeth sharper, as if the dream had bled into the waking world. And the worst of it was the laughter, small, private chuckles that came not from mouths, but from inside the skull, as though one's own face had begun to mock itself. They tried not to speak, for speech brought mirrors. Yet silence only deepened the suspicion, because men who said nothing could be imposters too. A patrol sent to scout the wire returned with 7 men. Only 5 had left. No one could say which 2 were false. They lined them up, rifles raised, trying to question them. But every answer was perfect. Every memory was intact. When asked the password, they gave it without flaw. Only their eyes betrayed them, pupils too wide, reflecting not light, but shapes that flickered like banners in a storm. None dared fire. In the end, they were allowed back into the trench. Men whispered afterward that perhaps the imposters had been the 5 who left, not the 2 who joined. No certainty remained. A soldier named Carroll tried to carve scars into his own cheeks. Jagged marks, he swore, would distinguish him from the faces wearing his form. He urged others to do the same, but none followed. They feared that the marks themselves would only spread the illusion further, that the breach would copy those scars until every soldier bore the same wound. Carell sat apart, bloody, trembling, watching as more faces flickered to match his. By dusk, he no longer answered when spoken to, as though afraid his own words would betray him. Weapons began to feel heavy, but not in the hands, heavy in the eyes. Each man's lasgun seemed too large, too bright, when reflected in the gaze of another. To meet another soldier's stare was to feel judged, as though one's very flesh was weighed and found lacking. Even eating became impossible. Rations passed hand to hand, but men hesitated before biting, unsure whether the food had come from a comrade's pack or from something else wearing his skin. Hunger gnawed, louder than the whispers. The breach widened further at dusk, not with battle, but with a single child's face peering over the trench wall. Wide-eyed, innocent, her features matched 3 different soldiers' daughters at once. They froze, breath caught, fingers locked around their rifles. No man dared fire. She smiled with too many familiarities, then vanished back into the mist. 4 hours after, men swore they saw her between them, crouched in mud, humming lullabies they half remembered from childhood. No one admitted hearing the song. To confess was to risk being marked as the next false face. Paranoia bred violence. A sergeant struck down his own corporal for saluting with the wrong hand, swearing the gesture betrayed him. The corporal bled into the mud, gasping protests, until silence took him. Days earlier, such an act would have been trialed, condemned, punished. Now, it was absorbed into the trench's rhythm. No one moved to stop it. Some nodded as though relieved. Others averted their eyes, too afraid to decide whether the sergeant had been right or simply the first to fall. Night drew tight, and fires guttered. In the dim glow of dying promethium lamps, soldiers huddled, their faces a blur of shadow and ash. And in those shadows, the lines blurred completely. Voices whispered names, laughter echoed in helmets, and soldiers stared at each other until every face seemed unfamiliar. The breach had widened beyond the wire. It had crawled inside the trench, inside the very flesh of loyalty itself. When morning threatened, no man rose certain of who lay beside him. They gripped their rifles tighter, not against the enemy beyond, but against the comrade within reach. The faces that were not faces had done what artillery and bayonet could not. They had hollowed the trench from the inside, until the line was no longer a defense at all, but a waiting pit where trust itself had drowned. The first shell did not roar, it hummed. The gunners of the 91st Siege Regiment braced for the thunder they had known all their lives. But when the Earthshaker recoiled, it sang. The barrel trembled with a note that rose above the blast, long and low, vibrating through the bones of every man crouched behind the shield. They looked at one another, faces pale in the glow of muzzle flare, and for the first time no one cheered the firing. They simply listened. The sound clung to them like incense, filling the trench, sliding into the ears, and settling behind the eyes. By the second volley, rhythm had taken shape. The guns no longer spoke in the staccato of war, but in steady cadence, as though a choir of iron throats had chosen their hymn. Earth answered in resonance. The mud beneath their boots rippled, not from impact, but from harmony. Each detonation, a chord that bent soil into waves. Even the ash falling from the sky moved in measure, rising and settling in time with the artillery's chant. Gunners muttered prayers as they pulled the triggers, but their words were swallowed, reshaped into syllables they had not meant. Sergeant Vere kept count at first, barking numbers to keep the rhythm of reload and fire. But soon his voice joined the pitch, his counting stretching longer, vowels drawn out until they blended with the barrel's song. 1-0-1-0-1. Double quotes. His crew echoed without meaning to, passing shells hand to hand like ritual objects. Each round caressed more gently than rations, than relics, than wounds. Their fingers trembled, not from fear, but from reverence, afraid to mishandle the liturgy their weapons had become. Men began swearing. The shells glowed faintly as they slid into the breach, inscriptions crawling across the brass in patterns too complex for mortal script. No one dared stop to confirm. To stare was to kneel. To kneel was to fall behind rhythm, and falling behind meant being left outside the song, and no one wanted silence anymore. Silence was absence, and absence felt like death. Better to chant? Better to fire? Better to belong. By dusk, the regiment's fire discipline had transformed. Officers issued no orders. None were needed. The artillery rolled in perfect unison, each gun matching the pitch of its neighbor. The whole line, a choir stretching across the mud. When one gun faltered, the other slowed to wait for it, not out of efficiency, but out of mercy. The breach had infected machinery first as echo, then as hymn, and now it infected men as devotion. Yet some resisted. Corporal Ars tried to jam his vox grill with cloth, desperate to muffle the song that seemed to bleed from the barrels into his ears. He spoke only in clipped orders, refusing to stretch syllables. But even as he shouted, the words trembled at the edge of melody, as though his lungs themselves had learned the tune. He fired his last pistol into the air, screaming for silence. The sky answered with thunder that bent into harmony, turning his gunshot into a note that folded neatly into the artillery's chant. Ars dropped to his knees, hands over ears, but the ground carried the song into him regardless. He convulsed, jaw opening wide, and the humming spilled from his throat without his will. His crew dragged him back to the line. He reloaded his gun like the rest, eyes vacant, but lips moving in measure. The enemy had not yet breached the wire, yet the Loyalists found themselves firing without target. Their shells traced arcs into the mist, bursting where no foe stood. Still the song swelled, every detonation another verse in the hymn, and with each blast, Soldiers swore they felt lighter, their wounds duller, their hunger forgotten. They fired not to kill, but to be carried. Whispers spread that the guns themselves had become quiet, that each barrel chose its pitch, each breech a voice, each shell a stanza in a psalm older than the Imperium itself. Veterans who had once oiled these weapons with grit and reverence now bowed their heads before them, pressing foreheads to steel, leaving smears of ash and sweat in devotion. Their officers did not chastise them. They too had begun to listen. The breach widened further when the hymn began answering back. From beyond the mist, replies came not echoes, but counter-harmonies, like choirs in distant cathedrals, joining the same song. The air quivered as if stretched between choirs on either side of the line. The battlefield itself transformed into a cathedral nave. Gunners reloaded faster, desperate not to let their own line fall behind, desperate to keep pace with the voices that now sang with them from the unseen dark. One night, during the fourth cycle of volleys, a shell did not explode. Instead, it cracked mid-flight, splitting open like fruit. From its shattering came a sound no mortal tongue could mimic, too wide for ears, too deep for lungs. Men dropped to their knees, clutching their chests, convinced their ribs would split to release the same note. They wept as the sound passed, some clawing at their ears, not in pain but in desperation to keep it. When the echo faded, silence struck like a blow. Men begged for the next volley to come, begged to feel whole again, and so they fired. Hours passed, days blurred. No one remembered how long the chant had lasted. Sleep no longer mattered. Meals went untouched. The only measure of time was verse and refrain, recoil and reload, pitch and counterpitch. Men lost themselves to it willingly, body swaying, lips cracked from repetition of syllables they did not know the meaning of. To resist was impossible. To belong was inevitable. When finally the guns fell silent, it was not by choice. Prometheum tanks had bled dry, the last of the powder gone. The barrels sagged, hot and exhausted, as if the machines themselves had sung themselves into death. The sudden quiet was unbearable. Men screamed, clawed at the barrels, tried to push empty shells into empty breeches. Some tore at their own throats, trying to make the sound themselves, rasping until blood bubbled on their lips. But no hymn came, only silence. In that silence, they realized the earth was still trembling, not from recoil, from reply. The song had not ended. It had only moved beyond their reach, and as the mist ahead of the trenches pulsed in rhythm, shapes began to emerge, walking in time with the hymn that no longer needed guns to carry it. He had been iron once. Commander Ralvek of the 117th Infantry was the kind of officer whose name carried weight in the mud. The kind who walked the line and made men stand straighter simply by existing near them. He was known for precision. Orders barked, sharp, clipped, without indulgence or hesitation. His rank was not only stitched into his uniform, it was carved into every man who had ever obeyed his command. To follow Ralvek was to know where you stood in the great war machine of the Imperium. But at the breach, even iron corrodes. The first slip came during a night barrage. Ralvek raised his hand for fire discipline, lips opening to deliver coordinates in the clean, measured cant of Imperial tactica. What came out was not Imperial at all. Harsh syllables spilled from his throat, guttural and twisting, each word carrying a weight that made his vox bead crackle. His men hesitated, confused. Yet the order moved through them like instinct. Mortars shifted, barrels angled, rounds were loosed into the night. The impact rolled back seconds later, carving trenches through enemy lines they could not see. The strike was perfect, but the language was wrong. At first the soldiers said nothing. Victory silenced suspicion. If Ralvek barked in words no one knew, perhaps it was only his vox distorting. Perhaps it was fatigue. But the pattern repeated. Each order, each rally cry, each command came in tongues unfamiliar, some thick with consonants like grinding steel, others fluid and soft like prayer. The men obeyed, because obedience was survival, and with each compliance, something in them shifted, not in mind, in marrow. Their bodies moved before thought. They found themselves firing in unison, advancing in time, their discipline absolute. It felt like glory. It felt like worship. But glory began to crack. When men reported back, they found themselves speaking fragments of his tongue, not the whole of it, just shards. A phrase here, a command there, syllables sliding out unbidden when they spoke to each other. They laughed nervously, said it was only mimicry, like children aping their father's tone. Yet the laughter died when they realized they could not recall the words once spoken. They lingered on the tongue, burned in the chest, but dissolved when remembered. Orders without memory, commands that erased themselves after obedience. Ralvak himself seemed not to notice. He strode the lines with his usual iron posture, but his eyes no longer held the same steel. They flickered, restless, darting toward corners where no soldiers stood. At times, he saluted shadows. At times, he whispered to the mud itself, crouching low, pressing his hand flat as though taking measure of the soil. His men told themselves it was tactical brilliance, that he was reading the field in ways beyond their grasp. But at night, when the wind carried his muttering down the trench, they heard words repeated over and over, syllables that gnawed at their dreams. Dissent never spoke its name aloud. No soldier dared accuse their commander. To question him was to question survival itself. But the doubts rotted inside. Was Ralvak still officer? Was he still rank? Or had the breach stolen even that? The men began watching for slips, how long his gaze lingered, how his lips twitched before words, how his voice shook when issuing commands that should have been routine. They obeyed him still, but now their obedience was lined with fear. Not fear of the enemy, fear of what obedience was doing to them. The breach widened further when Ralvak stopped using his name. In formal address, he called himself only we. His reports to higher command, if such reports ever reached beyond the static came in collective voice, as though spoken not for one officer but for many. His men began slipping too, answering questions with we, signing requisition forms with plural marks, forgetting their own singularity. Individuality thinned like mist at dawn, burned away by the collective voice that crept through every syllable. One evening, an adjutant challenged him. A boy named Hask, too young to know fear properly, demanded his commander repeat an order in Gothic. The trench froze. Ralvak turned slowly, his eyes blank, his lips parting. The words came, but they were fractured, broken, Gothic, twisted through with other syllables that bent the meaning sideways. The adjutant laughed nervously, then stopped, then began to weep, his own tongue repeating the same fractured order without will. He shot himself hours later, not in rebellion, but in apology. By then the men had stopped asking questions. They carried out commands, with eyes downcast, voices subdued, their individuality bleeding into the cadence of something larger. The trench itself seemed to bend toward it, earthworks sloping, barricades aligning with unnatural symmetry. It was as though the officer's words were not only orders, but architecture, reshaping mud and men alike into something closer to liturgy than defense. And yet, no one betrayed him. This was not treachery. There was no rebellion. Ralvak had not turned on his men. He still fought. He still stood in the line, laspistol in hand, saber at his hip. He bled beside them. He killed for them. But he was no longer himself. Rank had eroded, name dissolved, individuality bled into the breach. What remained was something else, an echo that wore his flesh, an order that carried his voice, a command structure unmoored from the Imperium yet still obeyed. The erosion was not sudden, it was slow, like iron rusting. Men woke each day with less memory of who had first spoken their orders. less clarity about what their commander's name had been. They obeyed still, because the habit of obedience was stronger than the clarity of command. They obeyed because survival demanded it. They obeyed because the breach had bent them, and once bent, a soldier did not straighten again, in the end. Ralvek stood at the trench's edge, silhouetted against a sky smeared with ash, his voice rising in language no record had ever kept. His men answered back, in perfect chorus. 1,000 throats carrying syllables they could not recall the instant they finished speaking. Identity had eroded, rank forgotten, names dissolved. Only the line remained, and even that line no longer belonged to the Imperium. The first glimpse came at dawn, when the trench smelled of damp cloth and half-rotted flesh, when the night's smoke had barely lifted from the ground. A tattered regimental standard lay in the muck, its aquila blackened, its pole splintered. No man expected to see it raised again. They had watched it burn the night before, flames licking its fabric to ash, sparks scattering into the churned soil. The banner was gone, yet when eyes turned toward it now, the cloth was not gone at all. Threads glimmered faintly, pulling themselves upward from the mud. Strands of soot stretched like veins across the air, weaving together, gathering ash as though ash itself remembered what it once had been. No hands touched it. No soldier dared approach. Still, the banner stitched itself back into form, each seam pulling tight with an audible whisper, like paper tearing in reverse. Color bled into the weave knot, the clean white and gold of the aquila, but a deeper red, a darker black hues that shimmered with an oily sheen. The eagle reappeared only in outline, its wings bent too wide, its beak opening as though in silent scream. What rose on that pole was not the standard they had lost, but something new wearing its shape. The men stared, and for a moment, none fired, none spoke. Silence pressed harder than bombardment, harder than vox static, harder than hunger. And then, as though compelled by breath, they could not hold back. They cheered, not in triumph, but in release. Their throats opened in raw sound, ragged and uncoordinated, yet each man felt his chest lighten as the cry left him. They had seen banners fall and burn before, and every time it had crushed the line, but never had they seen one return. Never had ash remember itself. Officers tried to quell the noise. They barked orders, raised last pistols, threatened punishment, but their voices broke against the sight of that cloth, against the way it moved without wind, rippling inward as though drawing breath. The men did not cheer for their commanders. They did not cheer for the Imperium. They cheered for survival embodied, for the impossible presence that stood at the center of their ruin. They rallied not because of the eagle, but in spite of it. Rumors birthed themselves instantly. Some swore the emperor had chosen to show his face in new cloth, a new sign for a new war. Others whispered it was the enemy's trick, a banner stolen from their minds, stitched together from faith and blasphemy alike. Yet no soldier turned away. Even those who muttered prayers of warding found their eyes dragged back, found their hearts pounding in rhythm with the flutter of that impossible flag. It was not the image that claimed them. It was the act of return itself. When the first charge broke across the wire, the banner did not fall. It did not even bend, lest fire split the air, bayonets clashed, screams tore the mist apart. Men who should have fled instead drove forward, as though the cloth's persistence poured itself into their marrow. Wounds that would have dropped them in other battles were carried with grim silence now. Soldiers staggered upright, clutching torn guts, half dead already, but unwilling to collapse while the banner stood. For once, loyalty was not forced. It surged, it spread, and no one could say what they were loyal to. In the nights that followed, the banner became liturgy. Men slept facing it, mouths moving with half-spoken prayers they claimed not to remember upon waking. They polished the pole, though no officer commanded it. They left offerings at its base bent shells, teeth lost in fighting, scraps of bone from comrades. Chaplains might once have called it idolatry, but no chaplains remained. Only soldiers, and the cloth that refused to die. Some swore, it whispered. Not aloud, not in words, but in the pattern of its weave. Threads bent and curled in shapes like script, symbols that reformed each dawn into new arrangements. Veterans stared too long and began muttering what they saw. At first the syllables meant nothing. Later, they became orders. No officer had spoken, yet ones the men followed without hesitation. Trenches reshaped themselves, patrols moved in new cycles, fire patterns adjusted, and every time, the changes saved lives. Coincidence, some said, but more began to believe. The officers themselves bent. Even those who had sworn oaths upon the eagle began to falter, their voices cracking when commanding men to ignore what stood above them. Some stopped trying altogether. Better to let the soldiers rally to something than to nothing. Better to live beneath a false symbol than to die under a true one abandoned. Quietly, officers began bowing their heads too. Quietly, their faith shifted. But faith, once shifted, does not return clean. The banner's cloth grew heavier with each day, its folds darker, as though stitched from shadow and ember rather than thread. Its eagles stretched wider, wings curving downward, until they seemed to shelter the men beneath rather than soar above. The soldiers spoke of it as protector, not emblem. They touched the cloth like relic, smeared their blood across it before battle, begged it to remember them when they fell. And when they fought, they no longer shouted the Emperor's name. They shouted nothing at all, their voices carried instead by the banner's silent ripple. The breach had widened. It had entered the place no enemy's blade could cut, no artillery shell could shatter. It had reached faith itself. What had once been the purest bond between soldier and throne now bent toward something unnamed. Men who should have broken, who should have fled, who should have wept in defeat, instead stood taller. But their strength was not loyalty. It was worship, misplaced and remade. Faith fed to something that had burned from ash into cloth, and in the deepest hours of the night, when the mist swallowed sight and only the faint shimmer of the banner remained visible, some swore they saw it move against the pole, not flutter, not sway, move, as though arms unfurled from within, as though a figure waited behind the weave, pushing outward, patient and calm. No one spoke of it aloud. They only watched, prayed, and waited for dawn. The banner did not fall again, not because it could not, because it would not. And the soldiers, who no longer knew whose symbol they followed, would not fall either. They had been claimed. It began with the smallest stirrings, a hand shifting in the mud, a head tilting up from beneath layers of ash. At first the soldiers thought it was the wounded, crawling back to the trench with what strength they had left. Medics rushed forward, calling names, dragging bodies into the line. But no blood flowed, no pulse throbbed, no lungs drew breath. The corpses stood, not staggering, not groaning, but rising, as if drawn by an invisible command. One after another, they straightened, dirt cascading from their uniforms, eyes wide but empty, mouths closed in silence. They did not attack. They did not even approach. They simply arranged themselves in ranks across the blasted field, aligned with the precision of drilled troops, though no drill master had ever called them. Rows formed where men had fallen, lines knitting together from scattered corpses until the battlefield resembled a parade ground more than a grave. Soldiers in the trenches froze. Their rifles were primed, their fingers itched on triggers, but not one fired, for each face across the wire was familiar. There stood comrades lost hours ago, Losburn still smoldering in their armor. There stood officers buried in shallow graves weeks earlier, eyes unblinking, wounds unhealed. And there, among them, were faces no regiment should ever see. Children's features, staring out from uniforms too large. Wives' and fathers' expressions, peering through shattered helmets. The breach did not distinguish between battlefield and memory. It plucked from both, stitching them into the silent ranks that now filled no man's land. The silence was unbearable. No moans, no cries, no wind. Only the sound of shifting ash beneath boots that should not move. Men in the trench whispered prayers, fingers clawing rosaries, but none rose to fire. To shoot meant desecration, meant tearing holes in bodies that still looked like home. To not shoot meant standing before an enemy that might, at any moment, decide to advance. Suspense gnawed deeper than fear. Corporal Dresk tried first. He lifted his lasgun, sighted on the shape of a corpse he swore had belonged to his brother, and squeezed the trigger. The beam struck true, chest bursting in a flare of smoke. The figure staggered, but did not fall. Its uniform sizzled, flesh blistered, but it merely shifted back into rank, as though adjusting for the space of its wound. Dresk fired again. Again the figure moved, never attacking, never collapsing. At last, it turned its head not toward him, but past him, gazing at something only it could see. Dresk dropped his rifle and wept, begging forgiveness, though no voice answered. More corpses rose as hours dragged. The field filled until the dead outnumbered the living, their ranks stretching beyond sight. Each new body stood where it had fallen, munitions still clutched in ruined hands. Faces half burned or torn, but still recognizable, and among them, some bore no battle marks at all. Civilians, elders, infants swaddled in rags that had no place on a battlefield. Soldiers turned their heads, unable to look, but the sight lingered in the corners of their eyes, as though the dead demanded to be witnessed. At night the risen did not vanish. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with reflection, catching the dim flames of guttering trench lamps and multiplying them across the field like a sea of stars. The soldiers stopped lighting fires after that. Better the dark than the illusion of heaven mirrored in the gaze of the dead. Rumors spread faster than commands. Some swore the Emperor had sent them back as silent guardians. Others whispered that chaos had hollowed them, filling their shells with mockery. But the truth lay not in theology. The truth lay in paralysis. No man dared act. The living fought only among themselves, arguing, trembling, some collapsing into prayer, others into laughter that cracked like bone. The field would not stay dead, and neither would the men's minds. Then came the touch. A single corpse broke rank, not to charge, not to strike, but to step forward. A woman's body, her uniform torn, eyes glazed, lips unmoving. She walked until she reached the trench's edge. A soldier there born, young untested, froze as her hand brushed his cheek. It was not cold. It was not warm. It was the temperature of soil. His rifle clattered from his grip, and he let her palm linger against his face until another dragged him back. The corpse did not follow. It simply returned to rank, still silent, as though satisfied. After that, none resisted when the dead came close. They reached into trenches, into dugouts, into foxholes, touching shoulders, brushing hair, pressing fingers against lips. Each touch left no wound, no mark, only the memory of texture that clung too vividly. Soldiers began to crave it. They leaned forward in hope, eyes closing as hands caressed them. Some whispered names of lost kin. Some begged for forgiveness. Others laughed, hollow and broken, when they felt children's hands in the dark. Officers tried to rally discipline. They shouted, ordered volleys, demanded fire. But when rifles rose, the dead only stood straighter, their silence louder than any war cry. No one pulled the trigger. Disobedience spread not as rebellion, but as refusal to desecrate. Chains of command fractured. The living obeyed the dead by not acting, and in that inaction, the line dissolved, as days blurred. The trench itself seemed more a grave than a defense. Soldiers dug not outward, but inward, carving niches in the walls where they laid themselves as though preparing for their own rise. Some buried themselves up to the waist, waiting for the soil to claim the rest. Others painted their faces with mud, mimicking the pallor of the corpses they now revered. The field was no longer a battlefield. It was a congregation. When storms rolled overhead, thunder split the sky in rhythm with unseen drums. Lightning illuminated the ranks for heartbeats at a time, revealing not just soldiers but hosts, uncountable. Some were too tall, their shadows stretching beyond human measure. Others were too small, crawling at the feet of the rest, eyes like burning coals. The soldiers in the trench begged for the lightning to stop, begged for the darkness to swallow them again. For only in darkness could they pretend the ranks were still human. The field never emptied. Dawn after dawn revealed more figures, more familiar faces that gnawed at the minds of the living. To kill them was unthinkable. To ignore them was impossible. And so the soldiers did nothing, caught in a stalemate, not of war, but of will. The dead had become their captains, their generals, their saints. The living followed in silence, not by command, but by surrender. And in that surrender, the breach widened again. For when the field does not stay dead, neither does loyalty, neither does faith. The men no longer fought for the Imperium. They fought for the promise that when they fell, they too would rise, silent, unbroken, eternal in ranks where no ranks remained. It began in static, not the ordinary wash of white noise that haunted every vox line at the front, but something cleaner, sharper, as though each burst of interference had been etched with intention. The operators first noticed it, hunched over their sets in the dugouts, ears pressed to receivers that should have carried only the fractured voices of distant command. Instead, the static gathered rhythm. At intervals, it pulsed with structure, like syllables broken down into lightning. The first time words coalesced, every operator froze. The voice was clear, resonant, and unbearably certain. It spoke from Terra, or so they believed. The message was short, almost painfully so, for words, repeated until the trench itself seemed to carry them in its soil. Advance in his name. No identifiers, no call signs, no code phrases to authenticate origin. Yet the soldiers listened, and in their exhaustion and despair, no one doubted. They did not question why the Emperor's command would arrive through the hiss of static, stripped of all protocol. They did not care. The order was pure, and purity was more convincing than proof. At first, officers embraced it. To hear Terra across the void was salvation. They repeated the words as command, embedding them into the structure of the day. Patrols pushed deeper, sappers dug further, volleys were fired not to hold but to advance. The men moved as though they were no longer forgotten, even in mud-soaked trenches thousands of light years from the throne world. They felt the weight of the Emperor's hand guiding them. The words became more than sound. They became liturgy, but repetition eats meaning. When the message did not change, when the four words sounded hour after hour, day after day, cracks began to show. Some soldiers whispered that perhaps it was not Terra, but the echo of their own need. Others swore that the voice shifted slightly each time, a new inflection curling around the syllables, as though unseen lips grew more practiced in their use. A few refused to listen altogether, tearing vox beads from their helmets, stuffing mud into their ears. Yet even without the machines, the words persisted. The static bled into the air itself, humming faintly in the silence between bombardments. Men mouthed the phrase in their sleep, their tongues shaping it without intent. One night, a new message arrived, longer this time, clearer, ringing with authority that made spines stiffen. The breach is holy. Step into it, and you will be remembered. The soldiers did not question how Command on Terra could know the breach existed, or why its tone bore the cadence of sermon rather than strategy. They only wept, some openly, clutching their weapons like relics. For the first time in months, they felt seen, and from men who had begun to doubt even their comrades' faces. To be seen was worth any deception. The Vox operators grew gaunt. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping, chained to their sets as though awaiting communion. They scribbled the messages onto parchment, carving them into dugout walls, repeating them to passing squads with the fervor of preachers. Orders no longer came from officers. They came from the hiss of the air, the crackle of the line, the certainty of a voice that had no speaker, and the men obeyed, not because they had been commanded, because they had been blessed. Discipline unraveled. Whole platoons abandoned positions to march toward the breach, guided only by the words that crackled through the mist. Officers tried to halt them, but when they raised their voices, their men turned away, not in mutiny, not in rebellion, but in reverence. For what was one officer's command compared to the direct voice of Terra itself? What was human authority next to divine dictation? The breach no longer needed to attack. It only needed to speak horror, to let the illusion of speech spread unchecked. Not all accepted blindly. A mechanicus adept attempted to trace the signal, his mechadendrites probing the Vox arrays for origin. His readings dissolved into paradox, coordinates that looped back upon themselves. Transmissions triangulated to the very trench he stood in. He tore open the sets in fury, only to find them gutted, wires charred, tubes shattered. The machines were dead, yet the voices still poured forth. He screamed of corruption, of impossible transmissions, of heresy in the lines. His warnings dissolved into laughter when his own mouth began repeating the message, syllables spilling unbidden as his augmetics hissed. The soldiers dragged him away, not in anger, but in pity. Even the most learned had been chosen as vessel. The breach widened through words alone. Men began carving orders into their own skin, pressing knives into flesh to inscribe the syllables that had become scripture. Their blood mingled with the ash, their wounds reopened with every movement. Yet they smiled, convinced that each scar was another verse etched into the living hymn of loyalty. The battlefield became not a war zone, but a cathedral without walls. Each trench a pew, each soldier a priest, each shell fired a chorus in a liturgy. No one dared doubt. Doubt, however, festered in silence. A handful of veterans whispered that the voice was too holy, too perfect, too free of the flaws that marked even the most disciplined commissar. Terra was human. Terra's voice should crack. But the words that reached them bore no imperfection. They were divine not because they were true, but because they were untouchable. And so the veterans did the unthinkable. They fired upon their own voxa. The crackling died. For a moment, the trench was quiet. Then the air itself spoke. No wires, no devices, no operators. The mist thickened, and within it, syllables bloomed like thunder. Advance in his name. The veterans broke first, not from betrayal, but from confirmation. The words did not need machine. They did not need channel. They needed only hunger. The men had wanted direction, and the breach had given it. Belief had conjured its own scripture. By dawn, no officer's voice mattered. The chain of command was ash. Soldiers knelt in the mud, their heads bowed, repeating the words with each breath until their lungs burned. They did not fight to win, they fought to obey. And in that obedience, the breach widened without blade or fire. It needed no speaker, for the men themselves had become its choir. The medic's hands never rested. In the trench, there was no rhythm to war but the rhythm of binding, stitching, sealing, and sending men back into the line. Flesh split under lawsburns, bones cracked beneath shrapnel, skin peeled away in sheets of ash. Normally, such wounds spelled days of agony, hours of augmetic labor, or the quiet mercy of a bolt to the head when salvation was impossible. But here, in the breach, wounds closed too quickly. The apothecary's salves clung to skin like oil, sinking deep into the grain of flesh, knitting fibers together faster than doctrine allowed. What should have taken weeks took minutes. Blood stopped running before a bandage was even tied. At first it seemed like blessing. Soldiers dragged themselves into the dugout, half dead, gasping, eyes wide with terror, only to rise again before their cries had fully left their lips. Burns closed into smooth pink tissue, gashes sealed beneath the medic's palm as if skin remembered its own integrity and was eager to return to it. Men staggered upright, thanking the Emperor, thanking the apothecary, thanking anything that let them keep their rifles and return to the line. The trench whispered of miracle, but miracles rot when examined too closely. Within days, the healed wounds itched, not the surface, but deep inside, like fire crawling along veins. Men clawed at their own bodies, tearing bandages away to reveal skin healed too perfectly, too seamless. No scar remained where there should have been one. No reminder of sacrifice, no proof of loyalty. And in the Imperium, scars were scripture. Without them, what was faith worth? The apothecary himself grew gaunt. His fingers shook as he applied each salve, though his voice remained steady. He told the men the Emperor had granted this gift, that they were chosen to stand longer than flesh should. Yet when he thought no one was watching, his eyes lingered too long on the wounds that sealed under his touch. His lips pressed into a tight line. It was not reverence, it was dread. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the salves were no longer chemical, but alive. That when the medic opened his satchel, the ointments pulsed faintly, as though heartbeats thrummed within their jars. Others swore they saw the bandages squirm, weaving themselves around wounds without his guidance. Soldiers began refusing treatment, choosing instead to bleed openly, their lifeblood soaking into the mud rather than risk being healed. But the officers ordered compliance. Survival was mandatory, even if survival felt like contagion. Then came the touch without salve. A guardsman named Cal was dragged in, his side torn wide by shrapnel. The medic pressed a hand to the wound while fumbling for his kit. Before ointment touched flesh, the bleeding stopped. Before bandage was laid, the wound closed beneath his palm. Cal gasped, clawing at the medic's arm, begging him to remove it, but the hand held fast until the skin beneath was whole again. When the medic pulled away, his glove was spotless. Cal rose and staggered back into the trench. Later, in the dim hours of false dawn, soldiers swore they saw the shape of the medic's hand, still imprinted on his side, as if burned into the flesh. From then on, men flinched when the apothecary approached. His shadow alone felt invasive, as though proximity might coax their flesh into obedience. Some whispered that he no longer carried the Emperor's healing, but the breach's infection that each hand laid upon them drew them closer to whatever rules governed the dead and the not dead outside the wire. Still, when wounds opened, they crawled to him. Pain triumphed over fear. Better to be whole and tainted than to die broken and alone. The medic himself ceased speaking of blessing. He worked in silence, hands moving with mechanical precision. Salves applied in thin lines that spread wider than they should, bandages sealing tighter than augmetic clamps. His lips no longer mouthed prayers. His eyes no longer met the soldiers. He had become a conduit, not a healer, and perhaps he knew it. By the end of the week, men stopped distinguishing between wound and healing. Pain was brief, fleeting, meaningless. Each injury closed before it could truly be felt. Loyalty itself became tactile, the ache not of sacrifice, but of the body refusing to remain broken. Some soldiers began stepping into fire recklessly, trusting the medic's hand would restore them. Others opened old wounds themselves, carving patterns into their flesh just to watch them vanish beneath his touch. The trench stank of blood, yet no scars remained. The air was thick with the sound of men daring injury, daring proof, daring the medic to make them whole again. And when the fighting lulled, silence reigned heavier than bombardment. Because in that silence, men felt their flesh itch again, deep, gnawing, restless, as if something beneath the skin strained to move, to grow, to bloom. They pressed their palms against their sides, their arms, their throats, and wondered if they too now carried the medic's hand inside them. Not scarred, not sanctified, claimed. They prayed because they always had. In the Imperium, Prayer was as natural as breathing, and in the trenches, it was the only rhythm that steadied shaking hands. Commissars demanded it before volleys, sergeants murmured it over rations, privates whispered it into their own palms before sleep. Litanies rose against the breach like fragile walls, each word a brick stacked against the tide. But here, the words did not vanish into silence. They returned. It began with a single voice, too faint to mark as real, threading itself between syllables when a squad recited the litany of iron will. The men thought it an echo, or perhaps a priest hidden nearby, but when they stopped, the echo did not. It carried on joyfully, repeating the litany in tones that were both too many and too few. No lungs could shape such resonance. No choir could layer itself so perfectly within one breath. The soldiers froze, mouths still open from prayer, as the air itself spoke their words back to them. The chaplain dismissed it as fatigue. He ordered the men to continue. They obeyed, voices trembling but rising. This time, the reply came faster, louder. Every syllable was mirrored with such delight that it sounded less like repetition and more like applause. The unseen voice clapped each phrase back into their faces, eager, hungry, overjoyed. The men faltered. Their words stuttered and broke. The answer did not. The answer never broke. By nightfall, the phenomenon had spread. Any prayer, no matter how small, was answered. Whispers of benediction before meals, muttered invocations while reloading. Half-hearted curses uttered under breath all were returned. The replies did not carry mockery. They were not twisted. They were pure, too pure, the way a child repeats a parent's words in unbroken admiration. And that made it worse, because in purity, the soldiers heard need. The air wanted them to pray. It wanted their words, craved them, drank them in with rapturous devotion. When men fell silent, the air seemed to lean closer, pressing into ears, waiting. The silence that followed restraint was unbearable. Every soldier knew that if he opened his mouth, the answer would come. And so they did. They prayed more, longer, filling the trench with litanies that once steadied them but now felt like bait thrown to something unseen. One night, Sergeant Malric tried defiance. He stood tall, lasgun raised, and spat blasphemy into the mist, curses aimed at the breach itself. The air answered in kind, not with mockery, not with anger, but with laughter. Joyous, ringing laughter, as though delighted at being spoken to in any form. Malric fell to his knees, covering his ears, but the laughter seeped through skin, vibrating along his bones. He shot himself hours later, his last act to silence the voice inside his skull. Others went the opposite way. They prayed without pause, desperate to keep the responses flowing, desperate to avoid the silence that followed. They chanted through the night until their throats bled, each prayer answered, each answer fueling them to continue. Their comrades tried to stop them, but when dragged away, they screamed until their captors released them, voices clawing to return to their partner in the air. To them, the answering presence was no longer an intruder. It was companion, beloved, sacred. The chaplain himself wavered. At first he forbade response, commanded silence, declared the answering voice heresy. But when he knelt one night to whisper a personal prayer, something no ear should have heard, the reply came warm, tender, filled with joy at his secret devotion. He broke. His sermons grew longer, more desperate, his words spilling into the trench in endless waves. And always, always, the answer followed, uplifting, affirming, euphoric. His eyes grew hollow, but his smile never faded. By then, the men no longer wondered if the Emperor heard them. They wondered if he had ever been the one listening at all, because what filled the trench now was not his silence, not his distant, untouchable gaze, but something immediate, something present, something that loved them with frightening intimacy. The thought was worse than abandonment. It was adoption. At dawn, the trench lay heavy with prayers, both old and newly invented. Some men composed fresh litanies on the spot, eager to hear their words echoed with such delight. Others carved phrases into the mud, speaking them aloud, just to hear them return. The air shimmered faintly with each exchange, as if vibrating with pleasure. It was not hostile. It was not cruel. It was worse. It was joyous, and joy in the breach was unbearable. Because joy meant welcome. Joy meant invitation. Joy meant the war was no longer battle, but communion. And in that communion, soldiers no longer fought for survival. They prayed to be heard. They prayed to be answered. They prayed, above all, never to be left in silence again. The first sign was subtle. A rifle grip that felt warmer than it should. The texture of plasteel softening beneath a soldier's palm. He tried to set it down, but his fingers refused. They remained curled, rigid, the weapon clinging as if welded to his skin. He yanked, twisted, screamed for help. A comrade pried at the stock with his knife, but each cut only peeled away flesh, not metal. Blood ran down the barrel, yet still the lasgun would not fall. Soon it spread across the trench, rifles no longer detached from their wielders, bayonets melded with wrists, ammo packs fused into chests, armor plates sealed tighter, not with clasps, but with sinew, as though ribs themselves had stretched to hold ceramite in place. The men became less soldiers and more armaments, each breath rattling through machines that no longer required maintenance. Servitors would have called it blessing. The men knew it was theft. The apothecary tried amputation. He sawed through a forearm where the lasgun had sunk too deep. Sparks flew as though he were cutting iron. The wound sealed before the blade finished, flesh knitting back into the weapon, leaving the man shrieking with the barrel where his hand had been. They gagged him, dragged him back to the line. He fought not the enemy, but himself, firing until his arm burned with overuse, begging for someone to pry it free. No one dared. Helmets became coffins. Vox grills slipped into mouths, teeth replaced by mesh, tongues tangled in wires that pulsed like veins. Men opened their mouths to speak, but only static hissed out, their voices erased, their words transformed into broken signals that echoed down the line. At first, comrades tried to answer, but the replies devolved into crackle, then into chant, until the trench no longer held conversation only, machines murmuring through flesh. Some bore it silently, accepting the fusion as inevitable. They marched with rifles grown into bone, shoulders braced by armor that tightened each day until lungs could only heave in shallow gasps. Others tore at themselves, ripping metal from skin, shredding their own bodies in desperation to reclaim identity. Their screams carried longer than shells, echoing through the ranks until men stopped listening. It was not a rebellion. It was futile. The breach cared nothing for will. By dusk, no weapon jammed, no rifle overheated, no barrel warped. Every shot fired clean, precise, endless, as though the breach itself supplied power through marrow. Soldiers marveled at the perfection, even as their horror deepened. They had become efficient incarnations. No reload, no delay, only fire after fire, burst after burst, until the air above the trench shimmered with the heat of ceaseless volleys. War had perfected them, and perfection was not human. One guardsman, Rennick, collapsed after hours of firing. His body shuddered, loss bursts still sparking from his arm as if reflex alone commanded them. His comrades rushed to aid him, only to recoil when they saw his chest split open. Inside, where lungs should have strained, power cells pulsed, their glow feeding current into his bones. His eyes rolled back, mouth open, no breath escaping. Yet still, he fought. Rennick no longer lived, but neither was he dead. He was a weapon, and nothing more. Rumors spread that the Emperor himself had reshaped them into angels of war, that their flesh was too weak to serve, so iron had claimed it. But the veterans knew better. They remembered the weight of a rifle, carried in hands that could let it go. They remembered the comfort of setting down a helmet after battle, of removing armor to breathe freely, of drawing blood not because war demanded it, but because they still bled. That humanity was gone. Now the trench stank of oil as much as blood, smoke as much as sweat. The breach widened in silence. Men no longer asked for orders. Their weapons aimed without thought, their bodies shifting in unison. Movements choreographed not by sergeants but by something deeper instinct that was no longer theirs. Even in rest, rifles remained shouldered, barrels pressed to parapets, eyes fixed forward. Sleep came with fingers still curled around triggers, dreams filled with the recoil of shots that never ended. Some forgot what their own hands had once felt like. Others wept quietly, their tears running down metal cheek plates that fused tighter with each drop. And yet, none stopped fighting. If anything, their fire grew fiercer, more relentless. Fear dulled in the presence of efficiency. Doubt eroded when every shot struck true. They no longer feared the enemy before them. They feared the absence of the enemy, the silence that followed when no target presented itself. For in silence, they felt the weight of their weapons still inside them, demanding, pulsing, waiting to be used. They were no longer soldiers defending a line. They were instruments awaiting a song. On the 10th night, lightning split the sky, and in the flash the soldiers saw their own reflections in the slick mud. Not men, not warriors. Statues of iron and bone, mouths filled with fox grills, arms fused to rifles, eyes glowing faintly where lenses had replaced pupils. They stared at themselves and could not look away. They were no longer afraid of dying. They were afraid of never being able to die at all, and when the storm faded, when darkness swallowed the trench once more, the sound of less fire continued not from targets, not from command, but from the soldiers themselves. Rifles locked to flesh, firing into the night because they could not stop. The breach had not only taken their faces, their faith, their ranks. It had taken the boundary between steel and skin, and now no man could tell where one ended and the other began. The breach gave him laughter, and it never left. General Arthian of the 34th Expeditionary Army had been a man of iron discipline, remembered for his stillness, even under bombardment. He was not beloved generals, rarely were, but he was trusted. When he walked the line, men stood taller. When he gave orders, they obeyed without hesitation. That trust held until the night his voice cracked mid-command, and what came out was not steel but laughter. At first it was small, almost human. A chuckle, raw from exhaustion, a slip a man might forgive in his commander. Yet the sound continued. His chest shook as he spoke, syllables wrapped in mirth. His lips curled upward, even as his eyes stayed flat. His laughter followed every word, writing commands like shadow. Advance. Hold the flank. Fire at will. The soldiers stared, uncertain, but they moved. They had to. In war, hesitation killed faster than confusion. The victories that followed silenced doubts. His orders were still flawless. His tactics honor. Each maneuver turned chaos into cohesion. Each counterstrike shattered enemy advances. The trench line bent but never broke, held together by his uncanny precision. Yet, all the while he laughed. At first the men whispered that perhaps he had seen something glorious, that his laughter was holy, touched by vision. But his days turned to weeks, and his mirth never ceased. It became something else. It became unbearable. He laughed at dawn when the mist rolled thick and the first shells landed. He laughed at dusk when the dead were counted and dragged into pits. He laughed when blood spattered his coat, when his adjutants screamed into their vox beads, when his commissars delivered last rites to the condemned. His teeth gleamed white against mud-stained lips, his laughter cutting through bombardment more sharply than artillery. No silence survived him. Even the enemy seemed to hear, their advance faltering when his voice echoed across no man's land like a hymn twisted into joy. His soldiers obeyed because obedience was survival, but their eyes began to hollow. To be led by a man who wept was bearable. To be led by one who raged was expected, but to be led by laughter endless, unbroken, inhuman, was a weight no discipline could carry. They began to avoid his gaze, speaking only in whispers when he drew near, terrified the sound of their own voices might ignite his mirth further. And always, his orders proved correct. His laughter did not break him, it crowned him. Some began to say the laughter was the breach's reward, that it had chosen him, not to corrupt, but to perfect. Others whispered that the laughter was not his, at all, that his mouth was only vessel, that some unseen presence found joy in carnage and spoke through him. Still, no one defied him. To defy him would have meant failure, and failure under his command was impossible. Rumors spread of soldiers who tried not to listen. A company covered their ears, swearing to follow only their own officers. They were wiped out within the day, caught in a crossfire the general had foreseen. Survivors limped back with tales of his voice carried on the wind, laughter rolling over the battlefield until their own lungs shook with it. They had obeyed in the end, not because they wanted to, but because their bodies had bent to rhythm. The general himself seemed unchanged. His eyes were steady, his stride firm, his uniform immaculate even in ruin. He acknowledged victories with curt nods, discipline intact. Only his laughter betrayed him, flowing without pause, without fatigue, as though lungs had become bellows and ribs mere cages for sound. He never explained it, never excused it. He simply laughed and led, as though nothing were wrong, and perhaps nothing was except that his men no longer knew whether to mourn him. For how could they mourn a man who had not fallen, who still guided them with unerring hand? How could they grieve a leader whose every command preserved their lives? To call him lost was to admit they were already dead, and so they swallowed their dread, letting his laughter fill their nights, letting it crawl into their dreams until even in silence they heard it. Some began to join in, nervous at first, then with abandon, chuckling along as they carried out his orders. They told themselves it was solidarity. In truth, it was an infection. By the second month, the entire regiment moved like a theater troupe, laughter spilling from throats as they advanced, volleys loosed in time with their mirth. The sound became a weapon. Enemy lines broke, not from fire alone, but from the terror of soldiers who charged while cackling, eyes bright, mouths wide. It was not rage that carried them, but delight, and the delight was worse. Rage could be resisted. Delight in slaughter could not. And yet, within themselves, the soldiers still mourned. They mourned the silence they had lost, mourned the dignity of discipline, mourned the weight of grief that once made them human. They obeyed the general because they had no choice, but each order eroded them further, until they no longer remembered what it meant to fight without mirth. Their war had become a carnival of slaughter. Their leader the ringmaster crowned by joy that never ended. In the end, the breach did not need to kill him. It did not need to corrupt him further. It had given him laughter, and that was enough. His men would never leave him. They would never mourn him. They would march at his side, laughing, until the line dissolved and the galaxy itself echoed with the sound. It began with a trickle that no one noticed, promethium leaking from shattered drums, pooling in the low ground as it always had. The smell was familiar, the stench of fuel that clung to uniforms and stung the eyes. But then the trickle did not follow the slope. It crept against the incline, winding upward, slow but certain, as though the liquid had grown its own intent. Soldiers laughed nervously, muttering about heat distortion, about trenches dug crooked. Yet, when they poured water from their canteens, it too slid uphill. The ground had not shifted. The rules had. Soon the trench filled with contradictions. Spilled oil gathered on the lip of dugouts, refusing to drip down. Pools formed at the top of berms, shimmering like black mirrors that defied every lesson of terrain. Maps became lies overnight. The contour lines meant nothing when rivers ran against gravity. when ravines filled from above instead of below. Officers screamed at engineers, demanded explanations, but none came. The compasses spun slowly, not broken, but indecisive, pointing nowhere and everywhere in turn. The soldiers adapted because they had to. They marched where the ground permitted, even if their bodies swore the slope was wrong. Boots dragged uphill, while lungs wheezed as though descending. Muscles burned with effort that did not match the angle beneath them. Men vomited after short marches, their inner ears revolting against landscapes that refused to obey. In battle, volleys fired high when they should have landed low, shells arcing into nothing because distance itself had warped. Then came the fire. Promethium caught easily, as it always did, but the flames did not climb. They fell. Columns of fire poured downward into trenches, waterfalls of burning liquid cascading against reason. Soldiers screamed as they scrambled upward, only to find themselves sinking lower. Every motion betrayed by gravity that chose its victims arbitrarily. In some places, grenades rolled skyward out of craters, harmless. In others, bayonets and bodies slid endlessly into holes no deeper than a man's height. Swallowed whole, as though by pits without bottom, the battlefield fractured into zones of impossible physics. To the east, men swore they marched across flat land, but their legs ached as though scaling cliffs. To the west, squads vanished behind ridges that from afar appeared no taller than dunes. Vox reports contradicted themselves. One officer claiming high ground, while another insisted they were below sea level on the same plot of Earth. Cartography dissolved into madness. Maps were torn, burned, discarded, because paper could not describe a world that no longer obeyed dimension. Fear shifted from the enemy to the soil itself. Men refused to advance, not out of cowardice, but because the ground would not keep them honest. They anchored ropes to stakes, clung to each other's belts, marched in chains of flesh to keep from drifting apart. Yet even ropes betrayed them, tightening or slackening with no cause, as though the distances between men expanded and contracted like breathing. To look back along the trench line was to see comrades stretch thin, their silhouettes elongating like shadows until they snapped back with whip cracks of displaced air. The breach spoke not in words, but in disorientation. It forced men to question their footing, their direction, their belonging. If gravity could betray them, what loyalty did flesh hold? If oil ran uphill, what oath still flowed toward the throne? Rumors spread that the emperor himself had turned away, that his light no longer aligned the stars, and so the ground mirrored his absence. Commissaires silenced such talk with last pistoles, but even their executions betrayed sense. The bodies of the condemned sometimes floated upward, drifting into the sky like pale balloons until they vanished into the ash clouds. The river itself became liturgy. Soldiers gathered at its banks, watching the black oil crawl uphill, whispering prayers into its surface. Some swore they saw reflections that were not their own faces of kin long dead, of officers long forgotten, of saints painted in frescoes back on Terra. Others dipped their hands, and when they pulled them free, the oil clung like tar, crawling up their arms with impossible weight. Those touches were changed. Some fought with renewed vigor, their bodies moving as though the ground no longer resisted them. Others marched into the mist without word or pause, walking straight into the horizon, never seen again. The officers tried to reclaim order. They ordered engineers to dig new trenches, to redirect the flows, to carve channels into the soil. But the channels filled against the cut, rising to the brim, pouring back toward the peaks. Soon the trenches themselves were rivers, men wading waist-deep in black fuel that shimmered with lightless fire. Helmets slipped from heads and sank upward, boots floated down into the sky. And still the soldiers clung to their las guns, praying that steel would remain heavier than flesh. Night brought no relief. Flames moved in curtains that fell like rain, sparks drifting downward from the heavens until they smothered in the mud below. Men huddled beneath the burning rain, too terrified to raise their eyes lest they see stars sliding across the sky in directions that no chart predicted. Even constellations seemed to crawl against themselves, bending arcs into spirals, collapsing order into whirlpools of light. The galaxy above mirrored the ground below. Faith inverted, loyalty fractured, orientation dissolved. By dawn, the men no longer marched by compass or by map. They marched by memory alone, clinging to fragments of what direction once meant. But memory faltered when each step betrayed its own weight. When the body insisted, the ground tilted, even as the eyes swore it was flat. Some men lay down altogether, refusing to rise, convinced that to stand was to risk falling forever into whichever direction the world chose to betray them. Others laughed hollowly, claiming that they had finally discovered the truth that the Imperium had never been level, only held together by lies of perspective, and now the breach had shown them its true slope. The river of oil kept rising, always upward, always against, and men followed it, not because they wanted to, but because it was the only direction left. Gravity had chosen sides, and the soldiers could only obey. It lay buried in the mud for weeks before anyone noticed it, a splintered Aquila, once mounted on the regimental standard. Now, nothing more than a warped piece of metal no larger than a man's chest. Its wings were cracked, its head cleaved, its gilt faded to black beneath smoke and ash. At first the soldiers treated it as debris, another broken emblem in a field where banners and bones rotted together. But one evening, when the sky bled red with false dawn, a sentry heard it whisper. The sound was faint, like the hiss of sand running through an hourglass. He bent low, pressing his ear to the metal. The whisper shaped itself into words, not Gothic, not any dialect he knew, but syllables with weight. The sound pressed into him, not through ear but through bone, reverberating down his spine until his knees struck the ground. He knelt without thought, rifle slipping from his hands, and began repeating the sounds as best he could. When his comrades found him, he was still kneeling, eyes glazed, lips cracked from repetition. The relic spread devotion not by choice but by command. Men who touched it felt their voices swell with phrases they had never learned. They did not speak them, they declared them. At first others laughed, mocking their fervor, calling them mad. But then, on the next day of battle, those who had spoken the relic's tongue refused to fall. Bullets tore through their armor, less fire split their flesh, and still they stood, voices raised in chant. They bled, yes, but their bodies did not falter until the chant ended, and so the laughter stopped. Doubt gave way to hunger. Every soldier wanted to touch the relic. The chaplain attempted to seize it. He carried it to the command dugout, intending to sanctify or destroy it. But when he raised his Crozius to strike, the relic whispered again, louder this time, words pouring into every soldier nearby. Men dropped their weapons and fell to their knees as one. The chaplain hesitated. His arm trembled. When the relic spoke his name he collapsed beside it, forehead pressed into the fractured wings. The Crozius clattered forgotten into the mud. From that moment on, no one attempted its destruction. The whispers grew stronger with each day, not louder, but clearer. They no longer sounded like language at all, but like instruction written directly into thought. Orders, prayers, reassurances, all fused together into something indivisible. Men no longer prayed aloud of their own will. They recited what the relic gave them, and when one voice began, the rest followed, as though compelled. Devotion spread like contagion, not chosen but caught, until entire platoons knelt in rhythm at dawn and dusk, chanting words they could not translate but dared not stop. Officers tried to maintain control. They shouted orders, barked commands, attempted to pull men back into the work of survival, but their words dissolved against the tide. Soldiers rose not when told by men, but when lifted by the relic's whisper. Formations shifted according to no sergeant's cry. Volleys were fired not by discipline, but by cadence of chant. The Aquila had become the general, and the men obeyed. Yet the relic was no banner of the throne. Its eagle's head bent wrong, its wings cracked, its symmetry broken. The more it commanded, the more it seemed to fracture further, its edges curling as though alive, metal flexing like flesh beneath a blade. And still the men loved it. Still they knelt. Doubters were few, but even they could not look away. Some refused to kneel, standing stiff with rifles braced. But their eyes betrayed them wide, unblinking, devouring the shape of the relic even as their mouths spat curses. One night, a corporal named Izison spat on the metal. He screamed at his comrades, demanding they wake, demanding they see the trick. The relic did not answer, but the men did, not by choice. Their bodies moved as one, falling upon him, dragging him into the mud. They did not beat him, did not kill him, did not silence him. They forced him to kneel. They pressed his forehead into the broken wings until blood streaked across the gilt. Only then did the relic whisper again. Only then did the corporal's sobs twist into chant. He rose with the rest, his voice one more thread in the weave. Faith had become contagion, spreading not through inspiration, but through command. The relic did not ask for loyalty, it created it, and in that creation, choice dissolved. Men did not believe because they wanted to. They believed because they had been made to. The breach no longer fought with claws or fire. It fought with symbol, with shape, with memory, and no Lasgan could resist it. Soon, even battle itself bent around the relic. When it was carried forward, men surged with impossible endurance, their chants louder than artillery. When it was left behind, ranks faltered, volleys grew weak, courage drained away like water through cracked stone. Officers stopped pretending to command. They followed the relic too, lifting it high on a pole, letting its whispers dictate their advance. They told themselves it was still the Aquila, still the Emperor's sign. But in the deepest hours, when the whispers grew fevered, when the words sounded like laughter or sobs, even the most faithful knew the truth. The relic spoke, and they obeyed, not because they chose to, because the air itself demanded it. It appeared first at dusk, when the fog rolled low and the battlefield smoldered with the breath of burned promethium. A figure too small for the theater of war stepped through the smoke, a child slight, delicate, dressed not in armor but in rags that fluttered where no wind stirred. Her bare feet left no imprint in the mud. Lasfear cut past her, shells shattered nearby, yet she did not flinch. The air curved around her, as if refusing to touch her. Soldiers saw her silhouette and forgot themselves. They lowered rifles without order, their eyes stinging not from smoke, but from recognition. She was no one's daughter, yet every man swore she wore the face of someone they loved. For one it was a sister lost to famine, for another a child drowned years before, for another still the infant he had left behind when conscription carried him to war. The smoke painted her face differently to each witness, yet always familiar, always beloved. They called out, some whispering names, some weeping, some stumbling forward with hands outstretched. Officers screamed at them to hold the line. No one listened. For the first time in months, men ran not in fear, but in hope. Reports multiplied. Squads abandoned position to chase her through the haze. Some claimed she beckoned, raising her arm with gestures soft and patient, urging them forward. Others swore she simply walked, silent, unaware, as though wandering through a dream that ignored the war around her. None could agree whether she ever looked back, but all agreed she never faltered, and no shot touched her. Bolter fire passed clean, mortar shells veered aside. The battlefield bent to spare her, even as it consumed everything else. The first soldier who reached her never returned. His comrades said he knelt, arms open, face shining with tears. The child touched his brow with one hand, and he vanished into the smoke. Not killed, not torn, a part vanished. His rifle clattered to the ground, his helmet rolled in the ash, but his body was gone. Some claimed he had been lifted, carried away to safety. Others muttered darker things, that the smoke itself had taken him, that the child was no savior, but a mouth wearing innocence. Either way, hope drowned discipline. Entire platoons broke from the line. They moved not toward victory, but toward her. Men who had once refused to abandon position, now left without hesitation, convinced that salvation did not rest in banners or orders, but in the tiny figure walking unharmed through the fire. Their faith was not in doctrine now, but in innocence, in purity, in the lie that something untouched could survive where they could not. And as they pursued her, the trench emptied. The officers tried to hold them back. Commissars fired into their own ranks, screaming of heresy, of deception, of trickery born from the warp, but their shots found no purchase. Soldiers, who had once trembled before commissarial wrath, now turned their eyes blankly on their executioners and walked past them. Some even smiled, serene, as if to say the punishment no longer mattered. Salvation was ahead, walking in the smoke. What was death compared to that? Even those who resisted could not unsee her. She lingered at the edges of vision, a small silhouette framed by ruin. Those who clung to discipline found themselves whispering prayers to her in the night, begging that she appear again, that she might choose them next. It was not loyalty to the Imperium anymore. It was longing, raw and desperate, for something untainted, for something clean. The breach weaponized hope more effectively than any blade. Horror had dulled the men, scarred them, hollowed them, until pain was no longer proof of loyalty, but hope that was sharper, that pierced deeper. To offer innocence amid ruin was to undo years of training, to unravel every oath, every chain of command. Men who would not break for despair broke instantly for the promise of purity. One night, a regiment followed her into the fog. Hundreds vanished, their boots and rifles left behind in neat rows, as though laid aside willingly. Their commanders found nothing but the echo of their chants. Their songs warped into lullabies, half remembered from childhood. The ground bore no trace of battle, no corpses, no blood, only smoke, rolling endlessly, swallowing everything it touched. Rumors spread faster than bullets. Some swore the child was the emperor's daughter, hidden from history, revealed only when his sons had failed. Others whispered she was the first saint of a new creed, sent not to lead armies but to claim them whole. A few, in voices shaking with fear, claimed she was no child at all, that the breach itself had chosen innocence as its weapon, wearing purity like a mask to lure the desperate. But none of them dared speak too loudly, for to deny her was to deny the only hope left, and so the men prayed for her return. They knelt in the trenches, not facing Terra, not facing the banners, but facing the smoke, chanting softly for her to come again. They begged not for victory, not for survival, but simply to see her. When she appeared, they would follow, always. For hope had made them obedient in ways fear never could. The child never spoke. She did not need to. The silence around her was command enough, and in that silence, men walked willingly into the breach, their faith consumed not by horror, but by innocence too fragile to resist. The fortress was supposed to be a sanctuary. Its walls of ferrocrete had stood for centuries, scarred but unbroken by bombardment, reinforced by generations of garrisons who trusted that stone and steel could outlast any enemy. To the soldiers who staggered into its gates, mud still dripping from their armor, the fortress meant survival. They believed its bastions were unmoving, its ramparts unyielding, its machine spirits bound and loyal to the Imperium. But when night fell, the fortress drew its first breath. The sound was subtle at first, a low groan in the walls, the rasp of stone shifting against stone. The men dismissed it as settling, the aftershock of bombardment. Yet, as they listened, the rhythm became undeniable. Every few minutes the walls swelled outward, Mortar cracking in seams like ribs under strain. Then they contracted again, dust sifting down from the ceilings of the barracks. Air shifted with them, warm and stale, a draft not born of wind, but of lungs. The fortress inhaled. The fortress exhaled. Sleep was impossible. Men lay on cots, feeling the rise and fall beneath their backs, as though they themselves were inside a chest too vast to comprehend. When dawn came, exhaustion dragged at their limbs, but fear dragged harder. They stood on parapets that shivered faintly with each inhale, laid hands on battlements that thrummed like muscle. No one said the word alive, but every soldier thought it. The change did not stop with breath. Bolter turrets mounted along the ramparts began to swivel without servitor hands. At first they moved in subtle adjustments, tracking wind, aligning sights, but then they turned further, following soldiers as they marched through the yard. Gunners muttered prayers, crossing themselves as the turrets clicked softly, their barrels dipping in acknowledgement like watchful eyes. The men learned to move slowly, deliberately, never turning their backs for too long. They whispered that the fortress was testing them, that it was deciding whether to recognize them as allies or prey. In the mess halls, the walls sweated. Condensation gathered along the stone, dripping into bowls of ration gruel, staining bread with metallic temps. Some swore the water tasted like blood. Others claimed it tasted like promethium. Either way, they ate it. Hunger commanded obedience even when loyalty wavered, and each mouthful felt like communion, like feeding on the fortress itself. By the third day, doors no longer opened with keys. They yawned wide at approach, hinges groaning like jaws unhinging. Corridors shifted when unobserved, staircases slanting, hallways bending. Squads sent to patrol found themselves returned to the same chamber, no matter how many turns they took, as though the fortress did not want them wandering where they did not belong. Officers pounded their fists against the walls, demanding compliance, threatening to blast open their own paths. The fortress answered with silence, then with a long, slow exhale that rattled banners on the walls until the men fell quiet. Faith split along jagged lines. Some soldiers knelt, declaring the fortress holy, a living bastion gifted by the emperor himself to preserve their line. They pressed palms to the walls, whispering gratitude, offering blood from shallow cuts as tithe. Others recoiled, insisting the fortress had turned traitor, that chaos had breathed life into its stones. These men slept with lasguns clutched tight, eyes darting to the ceiling each time dust fell like dandruff from unseen lungs. And yet, no one left. No one dared. The trenches outside were worse. The first death came without battle. A private collapsed in the courtyard, his body convulsing as though crushed by invisible pressure. His comrades rushed to lift him, but his chest had already caved inward, ribs snapping one by one in a sick rhythm that matched the fortress's breath. When it exhaled, his body deflated like a husk. When it inhaled, dust filled his mouth and nose until he drowned on stone. They buried him against the wall, but the wall bulged outward that night, swallowing his grave into itself. By morning there was no marker, no mound, only smooth stone where once earth had been disturbed. Rumors became certainty. The fortress was consumed. Each man counted his breaths against its rhythm, terrified of missing one, terrified of being caught exhaling when it inhaled. Some tried to leave, slipping through gates under cover of darkness. None returned. The gates remained open, yawning wide, but no one who crossed them was seen again. Only the echo of their footsteps lingered, repeating along empty corridors until fading into silence. The fortress began to choose its occupants. Barracks once filled with men grew smaller, beds pressed closer together, ceilings lowering until soldiers slept half suffocated, hearing the walls wheeze above them. Other chambers expanded, vast halls opening where once narrow corridors stood, and always the relics of war cannons, turrets. Voxaras stood, more alert, their movements precise, purposeful, no longer needing human hands. The men had become redundant. The fortress defended itself. Officers attempted to reassert control, conducting parades in the courtyard, shouting orders louder than the fortress's groans. Their men marched, boots striking stone in rhythm. For a moment, it seemed order might return. Then the fortress inhaled deeply, so deeply that every soldier stumbled forward as air rushed past them, banners snapping like whips. When it exhaled, the sound drowned their chant, replacing it with a single long note, like a sigh of amusement. The parade ended in silence. No officer tried again. In the end, the fortress did not kill them. It did not need to. It contained them, cradled them in walls that expanded and contracted like ribs, turned their weapons into ornaments for its own defense. They were not soldiers now. They were guests or prisoners, in a body that did not belong to them. Some continued to pray, convinced they lived inside a miracle. Others lay awake at night, counting each inhale, waiting for the moment the fortress decided to hold its breath and never let it out again. And when dawn broke, when the first shells screamed from the horizon, the fortress raised its turrets without command, sighted the enemy with unerring precision, and unleashed fire that split the sky. The men inside watched, forgotten, as their home fought without them. The fortress had chosen its side. It was no longer theirs. They did not notice it at first. The retreat was chaos, boots dragging through mud, bodies stumbling beneath packs, lasguns slung loose as men staggered from a battlefield that no longer obeyed them. Their breaths came ragged, broken by fear, by exhaustion, by the hollow weight of survival. Yet amid the shuffle of armor and the rasp of lungs, a tune surfaced. Low, uncertain, a hum carried by one throat and then another. No one knew who began it. No one admitted to shaping the first note. But soon it threaded through the column like smoke, clinging to every man who heard it. The melody was simple, a few steps rising, a few steps falling. It carried no words, no rhythm taught in chapel, no cadence learned on parade. Yet it spread as though every soldier already knew it, buried in marrow, remembered from dreams. They hummed unconsciously, lips vibrating with sound they could not stop, as if silence itself weighed too much. Officers barked orders to halt, to cease, to march in silence, but their voices cracked into the tune. Even reprimands came wrapped in melody, orders sung before anyone could stop themselves. By nightfall, the song had consumed the march. Squads no longer spoke in words. They hummed directions to each other, passed warnings and fragments of refrain, lifted the wounded to the same rising cadence. The melody shifted as more joined, harmonies forming without effort, deep throats carrying bass, ragged lungs rasping counterpoint, the whole column weaving a chorus from ruin. It was not beautiful. It was not clean. But it was endless, and that endurance mattered more than precision. At first, men told themselves it was unity, that the song steadied them, held their stride, pushed them through fatigue, but unity soured as it grew. The melody never stopped, even when they slept. Hums vibrated through teeth clenched in dreams, throats shuddered with half notes and unconscious rhythm. Those who tried to resist found their chests aching, their ribs rattling, until the tune forced itself free. And when one man collapsed, the rest bent their voices lower, carrying his part until he rose again, mouth slack, humming once more. The retreat became a pilgrimage. They no longer fled the breach, they walked toward something, though none could say what. Each note seemed to tug them forward, guiding their boots even when terrain betrayed them. The wounded no longer lagged. The song lifted them, their pain dulled by the drone in their throats. Hunger and thirst waned, replaced by the compulsion to continue. The tune itself nourished them, if not in flesh, then in will. And will was enough to keep them marching. Civilians who stumbled across the column caught the sound instantly. Refugees clutched children to their chests, yet within moments their lips moved with the same tune. voices joining seamlessly. The melody spread like plague. Entire villages emptied as peasants abandoned homes, following the hum into the horizon. The song demanded company. It craved multitude. No voice was spared once it heard. In the rare moments when silence fell, when the column paused for rest, or when artillery rolled distant thunder across the plain, the absence of the melody was unbearable. Men trembled, eyes darting, hands clutching at ears, as though sound had been ripped from them. Some screamed, demanding someone begin again, their voices cracking into sobs until the tune returned. And when it did, they sighed as though drowning men had found air. Silence was not relief anymore. Silence was death. The chaplains tried to sanctify it. They pressed the melody into Imperial hymnals, forced words of loyalty into its rhythm, but the tune devoured the words, twisting them into sounds without meaning, leaving only the rise and fall that had begun it all. The men followed, not the throne, not the banners, but the hum. It became liturgy without scripture, prayer without God, devotion that needed nothing beyond itself. Officers faltered. Orders were sung back to them, reshaped into cadence. Entire platoons ignored command, marching by the song's rhythm rather than maps. Columns split, rejoined, merged again, not by strategy, but by harmony. Soldiers found each other in the dark, not by name, not by regiment, but by note. And when stragglers rejoined, their voices slipped perfectly into place. No matter how long they had been apart, by the fourth week, even the dying refused to leave it. Men with lungs shredded by shrapnel hummed through blood, their last notes carried forward by the column. When they fell, their comrades lifted the sound, never letting the melody drop, as if death itself could not silence the tune. Corpses were left where they fell, but their voices seemed to linger, faint echoes weaving into the chorus until distance swallowed them. Rumors spread of the song carrying further than the march. Villages ahead heard it days before the column arrived, their inhabitants already humming, already waiting to join. Some swore the very ground thrummed with vibration, the soil humming faintly, rivers rippling in rhythm with the march. Birds abandoned their cries to echo the melody. Insects droned in perfect pitch. Even the wind seemed to sigh in time. The world itself had been claimed by liturgy. Hope and horror became indistinguishable. Some believed the song carried them to salvation, that each step brought them closer to Terra, to the throne, to deliverance. Others whispered that they were being led, not forward, but downward, that the tune was a dirge, disguised as hymn, marching them into the maw of the breach itself. Yet no one stopped. None could dot. In the end, the retreat was no retreat at all. It was a procession, a river of bodies flowing endlessly forward, mouths open, throats vibrating, the same tune carried from one to the next. They fled, but their flight became worship. They survived, but survival became song. And in that song, loyalty dissolved, because the melody did not belong to the Emperor, nor to Terra, nor to command. It belonged to the breach, and the breach had taught them how to hum. The war did not end with victory or defeat. It ended with silence. Trenches swallowed by ash, fortresses still breathing, banners that refused to burn. The survivors carried no oaths, no maps, no names, only fragments of what they had seen, fragments too heavy to hold. Some whispered the prayers that once answered back. Others hummed the tune that led them into exile. All knew the same truth. When chaos breached the line, it was not walls that fell, but certainty. And in that fracture, the Imperium did not lose its soldiers. It lost what made them loyal.